It is a beautiful day here in Yorktown, Virginia, and I'm going to be walking around the town to check out some of the historic houses, the sites, some graves, and things like that. And it's hard to believe, but I was actually here 20 years ago with my family. So I'm really curious to see what I recognize, what I remember, and also what I can learn along the way. Okay, we're here at Grace Episcopal Church in Yorktown to visit the grave of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Nelson Jr. Now, Thomas Nelson Jr. was born to a wealthy Virginia family, and he is Yorktown's most famous son. Well, during the American Revolution, he actually replaced George Washington as a member representing Virginia in the Continental Congress. And during his time in the Congress, of course, he signed the Declaration of Independence as a representative for Virginia. And he also holds the rank of Brigadier General, which he held during part of the war when he led Virginia militia, to include here at the Siege of Yorktown. And some of you may know this, his home here in Yorktown, the Nelson House, was actually used by British General Charles Cornwallis as his headquarters. So we'll go over and see that in a little bit. But Nelson really was just involved in so many aspects of the war, politically and militarily, and I just find that fascinating. And what's incredible about what General Thomas Nelson Jr. did for this country is that he sacrificed his own personal fortune to fund the Virginia militia and to also pay for other things to support the war effort. I believe also to help with the French fleet, that he died at the age of 50 on January 4th, 1789 in extreme poverty. When he originally died at his son's estate in Hanover County, he was buried there, but later brought here to be buried in the family plot at Grace Episcopal Church. And his poverty was so great, and he had debtors that were looking to collect from him, that he was actually buried here in an unmarked grave. So these debtors could not dig up his body and use his body as collateral, which almost sounds like something too crazy, like out of a movie, but unfortunately, that was the reality for Thomas Nelson Jr. And this is a really nice marker. It talks about his contributions. I'd like to point out that he's first and foremost listed as General Thomas Nelson Jr., and then later here we do see that he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, war governor of Virginia, and commander of Virginia's forces. And I love that right here. It says, he gave all for liberty. And they also have a newer marker from 2019 that actually corrects the birth and death dates from that marker that I guess are incorrect. So really nice to see that as well. And it's wonderful to see that the sons of the American Revolution and daughters of the American Revolution revere and honor men such as Thomas Nelson Jr. the way that they do, because unfortunately for him, in his own life, he was not respected as much, to the point where he had to be buried in an unmarked grave. And how many times now have we seen signers and visited their burial places where we actually don't know exactly where they're laid to rest? Still something that gets me every time, but just the reality of the life that they lived and where we're at today. But we're going to press on and check out some more stuff here in town. Now, this is neat. I'm just walking down the streets of Yorktown, and here on a random street corner, just come upon a piece of artillery. Looks like maybe a mortar, but that's what's so cool about towns like this, particularly Yorktown, is you really do have history around every corner, or in this case, on every corner. So I don't know what it's going to take to convince the wife to let me get one of these in the front yard, but maybe one day. But there are just so many historic structures here, some of them dating back to the 18th century, and which were here during the Siege of Yorktown. Here we see the Somerwell House, which is actually managed by the National Park Service. Looks like it's Little York Confectionery in there now. And this is another great thing. They have these interpretive signs by all these buildings to teach you about them. Prior to the American Revolution, the community of Yorktown consisted of individuals whose diverse jobs and skills contributed to the success of the port. And this is the home of Mungo Somerwell. The first reference to Somerwell is from 1702 court papers that reveal he requested a license for operating a ferry. And his surname in these records is spelled Somervell. And that, I don't know, it's so interesting. It's also another interesting thing about how people's names are written down incorrectly or changed over time, particularly with immigrants coming into this country. Always fascinating. Yeah, there you go. A little bit more history on the house if you're curious. But a beautiful structure here in Yorktown. But we're going to keep walking down the road because one house here, which is extremely well known, is the Nelson House, the home of Thomas Nelson Jr., the signer of the Declaration we just visited. And I don't think it's open today to go inside, which is a bummer, but it's still a home you have to see when you're in Yorktown, particularly when you get to see some of the battle damage on the house itself. And I just love wandering the streets of Yorktown and coming upon these historic buildings. Here's the Coal Diggs house, which I really like, that turquoise against the brick. And right across the street is another really fascinating structure that was standing during the siege of Yorktown. This is the Custom House. And it says here in 1721, Richard Ambler built this large brick storehouse, and from here, he and his son handled their collector duties. Ship captains recently arriving and merchants arranging for transport of goods would convene at Ambler's storehouse to complete the required paperwork and pay the assessed fee. In 1776, Virginia militia troops were using this custom house for barracks, and 2 years later, Jacqueline Ambler sold the property. And here we are coming up on the Nelson House. Again, this was the home of Thomas Nelson Jr., who actually moved into this house, which was his grandfather's house, in the 1760s. And it was here in this house that he and his wife Lucy raised 11 children. Of course, we know he supported the Patriot cause and became a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And during the siege of Yorktown, General Charles Cornwallis chose this brick house, the Nelson House, as his headquarters. Man, would you look at that structure. This is a massive, imposing building. And I recall reading that during the siege of Yorktown, Nelson actually told the American artillerymen to aim for his house, which is, man, talk about sacrifice. Again, he sacrificed everything for this country. But the house survived, as we all know, but there is some battle damage on the house that you can see today. Just walking around the side of the Nelson House here. Like I said, there's some battle damage from the siege of Yorktown you can still spot. And maybe some of it here, possibly, where the brick was damaged. And I remember from when I was here 20 years ago, if you can believe it, I actually remember seeing this. Yeah, there you go. There's a cannonball embedded in the brick. Now, of course, this is not an original cannonball. It's not like it just landed in there and sat there and stayed. But the damage here is original from artillery pieces. But years later, somebody added that cannonball in and set it in there, you know, just for a story, just to make it look kind of interesting and cool. But just want to make sure that's cleared up, that the cannonball hasn't just been sitting there since 1781. But the damage is real. And there at the very top, in between those two windows, you may not be able to see it, there's another cannonball embedded in the brick, which, of course, that's not original either, but the damage itself is. You can almost imagine being General Cornwallis in this house, using this as your headquarters, with artillery just raining down upon you, quite literally striking the house that you were using as your headquarters. That must have been a wild experience. Yeah, the Nelson House, an absolutely beautiful structure and really a centerpiece of history here in Yorktown, particularly in relation to the siege of Yorktown. This is the Dudley Diggs house, which was built circa 1760. So like the Nelson House and many others, this was a witness to the siege of Yorktown in 1781. And like those homes, it also received a great deal of damage from the siege. And these national park signs, which are fantastic at providing info on these homes, goes into that. It says, Dudley's home, like so many others in Yorktown, was damaged during the 1781 siege and rendered uninhabitable. And Dudley moved to Williamsburg and died there in 1790. So just imagine the amount of damage a house would have to take from an artillery barrage and this siege here to make it unlivable. That's what the town was dealing with at the time and how crazy things were within Yorktown. This is the Yorktown Victory Monument, which was actually authorized by Congress after the siege of Yorktown in 1781. Though construction on this monument didn't begin for 100 years, and it was not completed until 1884. But it is a remarkable monument dedicated to the great sacrifice that the American and French made here at Yorktown. And this is just incredible. Not only is the monument itself absolutely beautiful here, but if you look right over here, you can see the York River. Which, if you know anything about the siege of Yorktown, the York River and the Chesapeake were absolutely critical in all aspects of how this played out. Cornwallis was here, so he would have access to a port and shipping, whether that was more supplies or soldiers coming in, whatever it may be that he needed. And ultimately, it was the French fleet that defeated the British in the Battle of the Capes and sealed any exit for Cornwallis and his men here. So really, really fascinating. And it's so cool to be standing up here at the monument, looking out at the York River. Really, really neat. It's a beautiful location here in Yorktown. And yeah, what a incredible monument dedicated to the great sacrifice of both the Americans and the French. All right, I'm just walking back down historic Main Street here in Yorktown towards the heart of the town in a way, and I'm actually going to swing down towards the waterfront because there's a couple things I want to see. I'm now down here by the York River at probably the town's most interesting site that people can visit. This is known as Cornwallis Cave. It's a small sandstone cave here right along the York River, and according to local tradition, British General Charles Cornwallis used this spot as a shelter during the siege of Yorktown. Although I will say most historians debate whether he actually did that, because there's really no definitive evidence that connects him to it. But either way, this cave is one of the most interesting and a very popular site here in Yorktown. And today it is caged off, but really, really interesting to look in there. It doesn't go back very far, but I suppose if you were getting shelled at from the other direction, you could use this cave in any of these sandstone caves along the waterfront area as a site of shelter. But again, no verifiable evidence that Cornwallis actually ever came down here and hid in it, but nonetheless, a really neat site that you should check out if you're here in Yorktown. And if for nothing else, look how close you are to the river. And some really nice beaches, by the way. Good beaches for families. So just want to come down here to the waterfront to take in some of the views. And there's just so much going on in this town, so much to see. Again, you have markers pretty much everywhere that provide so much of the history, which I think is excellent, especially if you visit here and you don't know anything about what happened in the lead up to or during the siege of Yorktown. And I am always happy to come upon a Lafayette's Tour marker. This one says from October 18th through 20th, 1824, General Lafayette was honored in Yorktown with celebrations marking the October 19th, 1781 American and French victory. Just imagine the excitement and pride and all the emotions Lafayette must have felt coming back here all those years later on the anniversary. That is just so fantastic. I love that. Again, just some really nice views of the York River. This caught my eye. This old-looking cannon. It looks like it had been in the water for quite some time. Oh, interesting. It says this is a replica of a Revolutionary War British 4-pound naval cannon from the Battle of Yorktown. The original cannon was recovered from the York River in the 1930s, and that's at the Mariners Museum and Park. So I've never seen that where they make the replica look exactly like a weathered original cannon pulled from the water, but there you go. Very interesting. And of course, you can't visit Yorktown without coming to see the Four Heroes of Yorktown monument, which depicts General George Washington, Lieutenant General Rochambeau, Major General Lafayette, and Admiral de Grasse. That is so cool. Very neat. All right, guys, this has been a lot of fun. It's also really, really hot, so I'm going to go ahead and kick off for now, but I hope you all enjoyed the walkthrough of Yorktown with me. That's going to be it for this one. Now it's on to the next journey.